Welcome to the Captains of History podcast. In today's episode, Julius Caesar undergoes apotheosis while the blades of his enemies are sharpened. Triumph. Caesar returned from Africa and was flooded with honours and privileges by the Senate and people of Rome. He was voted 40 days of thanksgiving for his victory, double that voted for his victory over Vercingetorix and pacification of all of Gaul. The civil wars were over, and even for those former enemies of Caesar, the prospect of peace and stability was far too tempting to resist. The people were jubilant at Caesar's victory and ready to celebrate. Caesar, too. He had spent decades fighting wars for and against the Republic. He had conquered the vast territory of Gaul, subdued and pacified the East, defeated the king of Egypt and the king of Numidia. He was unvanquished, unconquered, undefeated on all three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So, with his return, he was finally able to revel in that most glorious of achievement a Roman could earn, a triumph. But being Caesar, and having so much to commemorate, he celebrated not one, not two, but 4 triumphs over the course of several months. Pompey Magnus had celebrated only 3. These were in honour of his victory in Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa. 14 years previously, Cato had prevented him from triumphing after his return from his praetorian governorship of Spain. Now, Cato, Pompey, and all the rest were dead or had submitted themselves to Caesar, and he finally triumphed. They were the most splendid and magnificent triumphs ever celebrated in Rome. The soldiers in their bright gleaming armour, the mounds of treasure and weapons taken from the defeated, the floats showing important battle scenes, and quotes from his victories, and many more wonderful and miraculous sights. At the climax of the Gallic triumph, Vercingetorix was ritually strangled. 5 years after his defeat and surrender at Alesia, the first and last king of a united Gaul met his fate in the city of his conquerors. Caesar's soldiers also marched in triumph, and as was their right, sung bawdy songs of their commander. They sung of his love affairs, and of his illegal seizure of the state. Only one was said to have angered him. It went, Caesar subdued Gaul, but Nicomedes subdued Caesar. Behold now Caesar triumphs, who has conquered Gaul, but Nicomedes does not triumph, although he conquered Caesar. This old slur on Caesar's honour still stung, and had political cadence. It is an interesting window into Caesar's mind that he cared more when his soldiers repeated the old calumny than proudly proclaimed that he had illegally seized power and destroyed the Republic. Beyond the military parades, massive public feasts were held, with over 22,000 tables prepared for the common citizens of Rome. More magnificent games and festivals were organised, and so the people were satiated. This included the funeral games for his late daughter Julia, which he could now finally hold years after her passing. He staged gladiatorial games on a scale never before seen, complete with full-scale mock battles to the delight and sometimes the disgust of the people. Alongside the spectacles he put on, he gave enormous largesse to his soldiers and to the common citizens of Rome. Each legionary received 5,000 denarii, while the citizens received 100 per head, as well as wheat and oil. The mood of the city was jubilant, and Caesar was keen to demonstrate that he was no Sulla. As the 1st century AD historian Velleius Paterculus said, "As victor, Caesar returned to the city, and, in a way that almost exceeded human belief, pardoned all those who had carried arms against him." The honours accorded to him mounted up, including the unprecedented right to be preceded by 72 lictors, where a consul would have 12 and a normal dictator 24. But the Republic was still as it had been before his victory, in total shambles. Caesar now bent his boundless energy to fixing all that was broken in Rome. Decades of intense division, legislative inertia, and brutal civil wars had left Rome in a sorry state. One of the most pressing matters for Caesar was the finding and allocating of land for his veteran soldiers. This would come from publicly held land, the Arga Publicus, confiscated Pompeian land, and land bought at a fair market price. Caesar was firm in this, as in all of his actions, that he would not repeat the mistakes of the dictator Sulla. The last dictator had turned out farmers from the best land in Italy to give it over to his veterans. These men had had no knowledge of, or inclination to, learn how to farm. The result was chaos, and many of those destitute veterans had fought in the attempted revolution of Catilina. Caesar would have no repeat of this upheaval. He settled his veterans in Italy, North Africa, and Transalpine Gaul. 80,000 of the urban poor of Rome were also given land in the provinces. By doing this, he removed a dangerous and unruly population from the city, and at the same time gave hope to these desperate unfortunates. Caesar's policy was always to find good land for his loyal veterans, while causing as little distress to the local population and landowners as possible. Caesar was following the well-trodden path of the popularis heroes of the past, men like the Gracchi, by instituting widespread land redistribution. This had been of central importance in the last 100 years of the Republic. Now Caesar, victor of the civil wars and master of the empire, could do what those before him had died trying to. He was fulfilling the popularis promises of 100 years before. His reforms did not end there. He increased the number of praetors from 8 to 10, and dramatically increased the amount of quaestors elected yearly. This made good sense, for the empire was larger than ever and needed proper governance. It also allowed more ambitious men to win public office, and more for whom Caesar could reward for loyal service. He never extended overt control over the elections, but merely recommended a candidate to each of the tribes. His candidates always won. Sulla, Caesar certainly was not, but it was still not sensible to go against the wishes of the dictator of Rome, of which he was soon made for 10 years, a shockingly long period for any Roman to hold a magistracy, especially one tradition and the constitution stipulated 6 months only. But 10 years was not forever, so Caesar's cowed critics consoled themselves. Caesar had many supporters to reward, and at times this descended into farce. When one consul died on his last day of office, Caesar appointed another supporter to be suffect consul for the few hours remaining in the day. with all the lifelong honours a consular office brought. Cicero mocked him by saying, "In the consulship of Caninius, nobody ate lunch." However, nothing bad occurred while he was consul, for his vigilance was so incredible that throughout his entire consulship he never went to sleep. To a man like Cicero, who had fought, schemed, and machinated his whole life to achieve the highest office, such flagrant disdain and contempt for the consulship must have been particularly hard to swallow. Caesar continued to flaunt his power in the face of his senatorial detractors, by replacing those who had been lost in the civil wars by hundreds of new men loyal to him. While Cicero and the rest balked at this, in truth it mattered little, for the true business of the state was completed behind closed doors by the dictator and his close advisers. In typically Caesarian fashion, the business of state was so competently done that not even his harshest critics could complain of mismanagement. Caesar did try to placate his former adversaries to some degree, particularly by integrating former Pompeian and Optimate partisans into his government. Most notable of these was Brutus and his brother-in-law, Gaius Cassius Longinus. Away from the Senate, Caesar was focused on attempting to improve the lives of ordinary Roman citizens. He reformed the grain dole to remove the rampant abuses and corruption which had festered. His reforms cut down the numbers from 320,000 to 150,000, meaning the poorest and most deserving received what they needed. He also created jobs for the freeborn citizens with his massive construction projects in the heart of the city. The Saepta Julia on the Campus Martius, the Forum of Caesar, complete with a temple to Venus Genitrix, his purported ancestor, and the Curia Julia, to replace the Senate House which had burned down in Clodius's funeral pyre. These monuments, some completed after his life, would stand at the heart of the Roman Empire for centuries to come. Taking inspiration from his stay in Alexandria, Caesar intended to create a house of learning and wisdom in Rome. To that end, he invited all doctors and scholars from around the world to come to Rome to be given citizenship in exchange for their knowledge. Caesar also began the mammoth task of codifying the enormously complicated tangled web of Roman law accumulated over the many centuries. However, this task was not actually completed until the reign of the Emperor Justinian I, over 500 years later. One of Caesar's greatest and most long-lasting achievements was the reorganization of the chaotic Roman calendar into the Julian calendar. For decades, it had been hopelessly out of sync with the seasons, so that winter festivals were celebrated in the blazing heat of summer. Together with the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, they fixed the calendar, removing the need for the College of Pontiffs to constantly and arbitrarily add days and months. His calendar was used in Western Europe up until the 16th century, when Pope Gregory XIII promulgated a revised version, the one which is still in use today, the Gregorian calendar. It was a revolutionary decree and helped contribute to a unified culture under the Roman Empire. Importantly, Caesar passed a law which stipulated at least 1/3 of the workforce of the large latifundia estates of Italy must be freeborn. The issue of slave labour working the fields of Italy had been a primary grievance of common citizens and a rallying cry for the popularis politicians for almost a century. Tiberius Gracchus, the first of the great reformers, had had a political awakening when he had journeyed throughout the countryside and saw slave chain gangs where before freeborn Italian farmers had worked the soil. Caesar was acting on this popularis policy and seeking to redress those wrongs. Apotheosis. Caesar was forced to return to war once more, as the two sons of Pompey had raised a rebellion in Spain. The restraint and clemency of his early years were gone. Caesar would no longer be merciful to those who defied him. The eldest son, Gnaeus, was captured, beheaded, and his head paraded throughout the streets. Those who had repeatedly scorned his clemency, challenged his good governance, and imperiled the stability of Rome would face the full, unbridled force of his legions. This attitude to rebels in arms had also become apparent in his dealings with the traditions of the Republic and the senatorial aristocracy. He scorned them and their petty concerns. While in Spain, he planted colonies and enfranchised new communities of citizens without recourse to the Senate. By planting colonies and creating citizens in Spain, Africa, Greece, and Gaul, Caesar was laying the foundations of a world-spanning empire, with subjects loyal not to the Republic, but in the personal patronage of Caesar. In other words, he was laying the groundwork for a monarchy. In this spirit, he ordered the rebuilding of the ancient cities of Corinth and Carthage, both destroyed by Roman arms centuries before. This was a sign of a new age of global peace and harmony under his guiding hand. Thanks to his repeated absences from the city, his grand plans, and the presence of Queen Cleopatra and the child Caesarion ensconced in his villa, wild rumours circulated throughout Rome. Men said he would crown himself a king, move the seat of empire to Alexandria, and be worshipped as a god. Mark Antony was supposed to have been made his high priest, and in late 45 BC, part of this came true. The Senate declared Caesar dictator was no longer a mere mortal, but was to be worshipped as a god. Gaius Julius Caesar had become Divus Iulis. Apotheosis had occurred, and for the first time in the history of Rome, a living man was worshipped as a divine being. The worst fears of Cato had come true. Almost. He was still dictator and not Rex. In February of 44 BC, he had been created dictator for life, and it was apparent that he had no intention of ever laying down his power, and all waited for him to take up the crown of the kings. He had been accorded the right to wear the high red boots of the legendary kings of Italy's past. But at the feast of Lupercalia, Antony had twice offered him a crown, and twice he had rejected it. This episode is fiercely debated by historians. Would he have accepted the crown, had the crowd not groaned in dismay? Was it merely a public relations stunt to demonstrate that he had no intention of becoming the king? For in reality, he had no need for a kingly title or a crown. He was a living god, master of Rome, and ruler of the world. What need had he of petty titles when he was so high in the esteem of gods and men? The Republic was dead as far as he was concerned. He was the ruler, and the titles he bore were unimportant. He himself called the Republic a nothingness, a name only, without body or substance, and so he dismissed the inheritance of the Romans before him. After a lifetime of striving, struggle, and hardship, he was the undisputed first man in Rome and in the world. the greatest Roman who had ever lived, and the greatest man the world had seen since Alexander the Great. At the dazzling height of his power, he feared nothing and no one, nor would he rule by fear, for he said he would rather die than be feared. Caesar had one more ambition to fill before his end: the avenging of Crassus and the conquest of Parthia. Massive and incredibly ambitious plans were drawn up for the complete defeat and assimilation of Dacia and the vast Parthian Empire. Plutarch's description of the plans shows an even more monumental military objective. Not only Dacia and Parthia, but also the subjugation of the wild lands of Scythia and the conquest of all Germania. This would have brought all of Europe and Western Asia together under Roman rule. Plutarch's plans are likely untrue. The conquest of Gaul had taken 10 years and been close to catastrophe many times. The conquest of Dacia, Parthia, Scythia, and Germania would take many decades, which Caesar did not have. Even so, his invasion of Parthia was terrifying to his Roman enemies. He would be gone from Rome for many years, leaving his lackeys in charge. And if he returned victorious, with all the wealth of Parthia, there would be nothing and no one in the world to challenge him. And so plots were hatched, schemes were made, and blades were sharpened. Killing a god. Caesar had dismissed his personal bodyguard of 2,000 warriors, proclaiming that it was better to die than to be feared. He scorned the hatred and jealousy of his fellow senators and noblemen. He proved himself time and time again to be the greatest of them, and knew that if he were to die, all that would result would be more interminable civil war. He was the last hope of stabilizing Rome and securing the empire for future generations. Some historians have claimed that Caesar was dying, or wished to die, due to his dismissal of all intelligence of assassination plots. And we know that he suffered from a form of epilepsy throughout his life. But there is no evidence that he was terminally ill or wishing death at this point. On the contrary, he had spent several months planning and organizing the logistics for the upcoming Eastern campaigns. His departure was imminent, and if victorious, he would challenge even Alexander for glory and renown. His exit from Rome was arranged for the 18th of March. On the 15th of March, known to the Romans as the Ides of March, a final meeting of the Senate was planned. The conspiracy was formed by former leading Optimate partisans Brutus and Cassius, but they were joined by high-profile Caesarians, Decimus and Gaius Trebonius. Decimus was the victor over the Veneti, and a leading general in the Gallic and civil wars. He was even named as a secondary heir in Caesar's will, and the guardian of any child of his blood he might have had. Trebonius was likewise a high-ranking legate of the Gallic wars, and the man responsible for the victory over Massalia at the beginning of the Civil War. Both men were old and seemingly loyal followers of the dictator, given positions of much authority and responsibility. But it's clear both had become disillusioned with Caesar's government. The motives of these false Caesarians was a mixture of jealousy, greed, and high-minded idealism. Many of these had been passed over for provincial command in high office by Caesar, due to their disreputable character, ineptitude, or cruelty. For high-minded idealism, none could outdo Brutus, and he was the figurehead and leader of the conspiracy, even though he was one of the last to join. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had led the Senate in expelling the tyrannical kings of Rome's legendary past. Graffiti was plastered throughout Rome to remind the young Brutus of his ancestral duty to rid the city of tyrants. Brutus persuaded the other conspirators that what they did was no political assassination or petty murder, but the just execution of a tyrant. Therefore, he forbade any partisan of Caesar's to be killed. No other magistrate was to die, not even men of considerable influence and position like Antony or Lepidus. On the night of the 14th, Caesar dined with friends, and some who were false friends, at the house of Lepidus, his master of the horse. One among the company inquired of Caesar what kind of death he would favour. Portentously he replied, one without warning. As the old Senate house had still not been rebuilt after its destruction in Clodius's funeral pyre, the Senate met at temples and various other locations. The meeting on the Ides of March was held in the Curia of Pompey's magnificent theatre. The towering statue of the dead general still adorned the chamber. In typical Caesarian generosity, Caesar had commanded that the statue remain despite the wars with Pompey. Inside the theatre itself, great games were being held for the people. Gladiators and exotic beasts were spending their lives' blood into the sand. Caesar's wife Calpurnia had terrible dreams and premonitions the night before and implored her husband not to attend. A soothsayer had also warned of danger. Beware the Ides of March. Caesar almost chose not to go until the trusted Decimus came and persuaded him to come. It had been a terrifying wait for the conspirators outside of Pompey's theatre, listening to the roars and groans of the crowd, not knowing whether they had been discovered or not. At last, Caesar appeared and entered the Curia, sitting himself upon his gilded chair. Now, everything happened all at once. A senator by the name of Lucius Tullius Cimber approached in humble entreaty with a petition that his brother be allowed to return from exile. Then he grabbed hold of Caesar's toga. Why, Caesar cried, this is violence. All of a sudden, 60 senators converged on him with daggers drawn. Former friends and enemies united to spill his blood. Men he had thought of as sons, like Brutus and Decimus. The histories record Caesar cried out, saying, "You too, my boy." The only question was which Brutus he was speaking to. In common understanding, thanks in great part to Shakespeare, it is Marcus Brutus, the son of Caesar's old lover, Servilia. However, Decimus appears the far likelier candidate. He had been close to Caesar for decades, fought valiantly by his side in Gaul and in the Civil War, was named an heir in his will, and had been the man who persuaded Caesar to attend the ill-fated meeting. Marcus Brutus was the nephew of Cato, and though a friend and admirer of Caesar, his politics was clear. It was Decimus who was the true betrayer. After a life of unbelievable struggle, terrible hardship, and glory beyond comprehension, this final and terrible betrayal was too much for Caesar. To hide the last agonies of death and retain his dignitas even in his last moments, with his final strength, he covered his face with the folds of his shredded toga. Caesar passed from the world, a broken and sorry thing, lying in a spreading pool of blood at the foot of Pompey's statue. A living god had been murdered, and Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator perpetuo, was dead. A new Caesar. In the midst of this chaos and violence, the rest of the Senate sat stunned, utterly incomprehensive of what was happening in front of their eyes. But when the killing was done, they fled, assassins and innocent alike. When news spread throughout the city that Caesar dictator was murdered in the very Senate house, Rome itself was shocked. There was rioting, looting, and general chaos as law and order broke down. The assassins were seemingly paralyzed. Eventually, Brutus and Cassius went down to the Forum and gave speeches on the virtues of tyrannicide. They were met by a growing crowd that was cold and increasingly hostile. If the conspirators had expected a joyful and jubilant Roman people to erupt into celebration for their deed, they couldn't have been more wrong. Initially, Antony and Lepidus counselled for conciliation. Caesar was not declared a tyrant, and all of his acts were allowed to stand, while at the same time his assassins were granted an amnesty. But Antony was merely biding his time. At Caesar's funeral, Antony inflamed the massive crowds by talking of Caesar's great and abiding love for the Roman people, proven beyond doubt by the generous endowments in his will, money for every citizen of Rome, and his own private gardens and villa for their use. Antony declaimed on Caesar's many great deeds done for the glory of Rome, and of the vile betrayers who only a few days before had voted him incredible honours. The crowd, full of emotion, heartbroken at the loss of their champion, and spurred on by Antony's rhetoric, took his corpse and built a great funeral pyre in the very Forum itself. His veteran soldiers, with tears in their eyes, threw their weapons and armour upon the pyre, and the women of Rome gave their finest jewellery. In this final act, the Roman people showed their enduring love and affection for Caesar. He had ever been their advocate, friend, and champion. The foreigners of Rome, whom Caesar had grown up around in the Suburra, also added their own lamentations. Particularly prominent were the Jews of Rome. In his birth month, in 44 BC, called July in his honour, a great comet appeared in the sky. The Roman people took this to mean the deification of Caesar. Known as the Julian star, it appeared to prove to Senate and people alike that Caesar had been a god and would now dwell forever with the gods above. The cult of the comet was instrumental in aiding the rise of Caesar's chosen heir. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, had been named as the principal heir in Caesar's will and adopted as Caesar's son. From that day forward, he was known as Gaius Julius Caesar, or Octavianus to his enemies, and later he was known as Imperator Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. With his final act, Caesar had shown his brilliance as a man, naming the hitherto obscure and unimportant 19-year-old as his heir, the greatest and most dangerous legacy in world history. No one, not Antony, Cleopatra, Cicero, Lepidus, or the rest, believed that the young man would live for long. But Caesar had seen in him something which no one else had. The boy Octavian would rise to become another of the greatest captains of history. He took the name Caesar, and forever after, the rule of the empire was held by a man claiming the right to call himself Caesar. A few weeks after his murder, one of his loyal followers said that if Caesar, with all his genius, could not find a way out, then who will find a way? Rome had been in a constant state of crisis ever since Tiberius Gracchus's tribunate. Caesar had appeared as the saviour who would end the interminable civil wars and political crises. Only a man of his immense intellect and luck could hope to solve the state's problem. But now he was dead. Not long after, Brutus, Cassius, and many of the conspirators fled the city. The men involved in Caesar's murder would meet bloody ends of their own. Gaius Trebonius was tortured to death by Caesar's loyal lieutenant Dolabella. Decimus, fleeing from the vengeful Caesarian host, was captured and beheaded by a Gallic chieftain. Antony, Lepidus, and the young Caesar put aside their squabbling and formed a united Caesarian front called the Second Triumvirate. Saying that Caesar's famed clemency had resulted in his murder, they had no intention of showing mercy to their enemies. The proscription lists, so hated and feared in the days of Sulla, were reinstituted. Brutus and Cassius were defeated by Antony and the young Caesar at the Battle of Philippi. Following this, the empire was split into three: Caesar in Italy in the west, Lepidus in Africa, and Antony in the east. Lepidus was always the weakest of the three, and he was soon consumed by Caesar. The fate of the Roman world came down to a titanic struggle between the two chief partisans of Caesar. Antony, with the might of Egypt and the eastern provinces, against the young Caesar and his loyal friend and general, the great Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. At the Battle of Actium, the forces of Caesar destroyed Antony and sent him en route back to Egypt. Antony and his lover, the Queen Cleopatra, would commit suicide and leave the whole world under the dominion of the young Caesar. Antony had mocked the young man, dismissing him as merely a name with no substance. But what a name it was! The name Caesar won the young man loyal adherents, financial backers of substantial might, and the love of the legions. The young Caesar also showed that his great uncle and adopted father's judgment was still the keenest in Rome, even long after he was dead. The young Caesar was the last warlord standing at the end of the civil wars, and became the great Augustus. He forged a new state, deeply revolutionary, while being rooted in the oldest traditions and values of Rome. For his whole life, Augustus lavished praise and adulation on Caesar. On the site of his cremation, he built a great temple to the deified Julius. In the end, Augustus reigned for over 40 years, and his legitimacy came from his stabilizing and benevolent rule. But it was the name and the legacy of Julius Caesar which was the bedrock of the Principate and the Roman Empire.